In the industry, we call this punching up. In this follow-up to my last video, I'll cover the title topic, as well as a few others. I wanted to start this, though, with a note on the insanity of WotC and the open game license. By the way, I actually had to script this. The last one I was able to do off the cuff. This one, there was just so much information. I needed to put it all here, so my reading is going to be a little stilted, but after refreshing my memory a little on the early history of WotC, I was reminded that it started as a company that wanted to publish D&D supplements. If memory serves, the first supplement they tried to publish was called Primal Order, which aimed to provide god-level functionality to D&D characters, although I think there was some considerable effort made to make the supplement system agnostic. How ironic, though, that present-day WotC would go on to try and dismantle the official OGL they established in an attempt to take away everyone else's ability to do the very thing WotC itself did to get started. Maybe it's more pathetic than ironic. I don't know. You tell me. To his credit, though, and this won't be the last time I say that, Scaff Elias led the interview process for the next D&D project lead after WotC acquired D&D from TSR. He made sure, among other things, that the person he hired, who ended up being Bill Slavicsek, Bill Slavicsek, to lead design, was supportive of the open game license, which would go on to allow WotC and D&D to dominate the tabletop RPG market. Scaff Elias is truly a gem. As a final note on D&D and the OGL here, Scaff hilariously notes that the restrictions TSR put on D&D is exactly what made them stagnate and putter out until they eventually collapsed. A look into D&D's future for today's WotC. And now to Magic. In initial playtesting, they didn't think they could fully test the economics of this newfangled thing called the trading card game. But they very quickly became aware that cards like the Power 9 were broken. Not only do multiple people involved reiterate this same story, but Scaff and Richard actually seemed to take it seriously enough to try and do the math to figure out how many broken cards might appear in a playgroup. In some cases, they adjusted the rarity of cards based on these calculations to try and mitigate this. But wait, what? So let me get this straight here. They didn't try to solve the issue. They instead broke their own game to capitalize on a scam. Well, yeah. Scaff even mentions an email he remembers receiving from this early time before Magic was printed that says, either the broken cards will make the game fail, or they'll be rich. Obviously, this is a joke because they knew they could just ban the cards if need be, but that knowledge of them would spread as it had through the playtests. They didn't need to test the economics, they already had all the information they needed. The exact same thing would happen when the game was released, just at a larger scale. They knew their game was solvable, and that if you spent enough money buying the product, then you could guarantee you would always win. To further illustrate why this is a slimy, underhanded, and game-violating practice, there's the story of Barry Reich, the first playtester of Magic ever. He quickly realized the value of the Moxes, and may very well have accepted a trade with another early playtester for their Mox Emerald in exchange for Barry's Forest. The other playtester didn't understand the difference between the Mox Emerald and Barry's Forest. Their Mox Emerald, I should say. Now, some of you may rightfully laugh at this exchange, but think about what that implies they knew they would be doing to children who would soon be spending their parents' hard-earned money on this game, only for it to be a pay-to-win gambling scam they'll never be able to afford. Magic is basically a Ponzi scheme that preys on kids and collectors, both of whom think they're buying collectible game pieces when in fact they're just buying a cardboard gambling scam. So, kind of a new scratch-off ticket where instead of scratching off the ticket to see if you win, you get a whole pack of pre-scratched tickets where usually none of them are winners, except it's marketed as a game for kids. But wait, there's more. This is because Richard's instincts and the instincts that drove a lot of how the business model shaped Magic's design were consistently bad. One of these instincts was, of course, ante. This should have been ruled out during playtesting because all the playtesters ended up rejecting the rule, but Richard stubbornly, at least that's the way it seems, forced it through to printing. It actually lasted for several sets too. His rationale was based on a desire to make Magic more like blackjack, which is not a game. He also thought it would help redistribute broken cards throughout playtest groups, but again, everyone in early playtesting immediately realized this was a terrible design given the artificial rarity of playable cards, and they played without ante. Everything in this video is confirmed not just by Richard himself, but also others who worked with him at the time, based on numerous sources both dated and contemporary. For contemporary examples, check out anything WotC does, the Mark Rosewater Drive to Work podcast, which WotC hid after the Magic 30th debacle, the WotC video Enter the Battlefield, the Alpha Playtesters, and any of the increasingly numerous interviews with WotC staff, both past and present, to say nothing of the numerous self-damning articles WotC itself has published over the years. Mostly here, though, I'm referring to Scaff and Peter talking in their fireside chats, which I'm directly quoting from. What I'm saying is, calling Magic a pay-to-win gambling scam that targets children is completely 100% accurate, based not only on an objective analysis of its design, but the actual words and stated intent of the creator of Magic himself, as well as Peter, Scaff, and many others involved in the early development and production of Magic. It is also true of current Magic and confirmed by current designers, as well as just looking at what currently gets printed. Now let's talk about card backs. Yet another time, Richard tried to make Magic even worse by trying to make it even more like a solvable gambling game, which is bad on account of it being both solvable and introducing even more randomness to win states, both of which violate real game design. Here, Richard wanted each new Magic expansion to have different card backs. This was because, for some reason, he thought it would be a good idea if people could tell which cards they were about to draw, and for their opponent to also be able to tell. It is assumed, too, that more information would be revealed simply by nature of shuffling and handling the cards. The integrity of the design Richard had in mind was flimsier than wet tissue paper. Quote from Scaff Elias: "We wanted to sell expansions so that you kept getting hooked and it kept refreshing." In reference to early cards getting either banned or restricted, Scaff also says, "The restricteds were the ones that were just super powerful and essentially, mostly, the ones that could lead to like first turn kills, which would make the game more random, so they're dispersed throughout the deck. It's less likely for that to happen," referring to first turn kills. Peter Adkison then responds, "Yep, yeah, makes sense." This is clearly stupid because, as I mentioned, Scaff said in the previous video, because those cards didn't get banned, they still broke the game and made it pay to win. From here, though, we see Scaff's genius start to shine through as he and Peter start talking about the Fallen Empires debacle. Peter, as you would expect, says that from his perspective, Fallen Empires was a disaster, but Scaff says that Peter is wrong, and Peter has him explain why he thinks Fallen Empires was a success. Scaff then says something that every game designer should immediately go to a mirror and write on their forehead. "I would just look at things from the perspective of really not the company or the designers or anything, but like, who's your average fan?" Translation: focus on doing what's right by your players, and everything else will follow. After this, though, Scaff says something that I find a little sad and very disappointing, but it again illustrates that game designers don't actually know how to design games, and also, of course, further illustrates that Magic was not designed to be a game, but rather a scam. Scaff says, and I quote, "The product," referring to Fallen Empires, was a large portion of the buying was done by speculators and collectors, and so we were never going to be able to be in control of the price of our product. Unless we broke that whole cycle. And there's only one way to break that cycle." This is in reference to overprinting Fallen Empires in order to bring the price down. Scaff is saying here that he thinks the only way they could have had any control over the price of their product was to control the print run. Now, aside from this being a little misleading, because we know he's misspeaking here, because we know he's also very aware that you can affect demand on these products by adding broken cards. But what's disappointing about this to me is not that Scaff would have needed my grand unified theory of game design in order to have solved Magic's problems, but that being a mathematician, Scaff should have been able to see the converse of the issue, and also all the other mathematicians on the team there, including Richard. That if you balanced Magic and didn't make it pay to win, so that skill was actually determined, or that skill was what actually determined competitiveness instead of how much a player spent on their cards, then you'd end up with a much less drastic swing in price from rare to common. The cards players bought would retain more value, and everything on the design and production ends would also go a lot smoother. As a pre-note on Fallen Empires and the handful of sets that followed, they were all too underpowered and overprinted. This is not a way to solve your problem, which was making it accessible to players who were getting priced out even at the retail level. It just gives everyone cards they don't want. Ironically, here, Peter is the one who turns out to be right when he responds that he thinks they could have handled the era of overprinted sets more elegantly. He also reveals here that that there was indeed internal pressure within the company to continue with the practice of selling a scam. In his words, quote, "There were people in the company, people in senior management who were like, no, let's just manage the speculation thing. It's really always important that it's a collectible." There were people that were very invested in the idea that for Magic to be successful, we had to always undersupply the market so that there would be this frenzy to buy it. Some of those were undoubtedly people Jesper Meerforce would affectionately refer to as the suits. To Scaff's credit, though, he says, quote, "They were trying to manage it as a business, and I think some people there, meaning at Wizards, had more confidence in it as a game." I should say, end quote. What I'm pointing out Scaff's quote gets right here is that the suits weren't wrong about collectability being important. It very much is. What they were wrong about was that this was the way to go about it. It wasn't, and it still isn't, despite this being the business model for the entire TCG industry for the last 30 years. I've explained this before in my video responding to Edwin the Magic Engineer, but rares would still be more valuable than commons. It's just that if cards were not designed broken, then commons would retain more value because they'd actually be playable on a collectible scale. This also assumes that you don't alternatively make garbage cards that are intentionally made to be unplayable. If Magic was balanced, then increasing print runs could be done much more carefully and with much less urgency. Early print runs could be tight, with reprints depending on both allocation demand and post-release demand. Allocations could also be less strict since early print runs could reliably remain tighter. To be fair, though, I don't think I went into that much detail in my response to Edwin's video, or to Edwin in that video. It's just something a mathematician, let alone an entire R&D team of mathematicians dedicated to figuring out exactly these things, should have figured out, especially since it's been 30 fucking years. But wait, I saved the best for last. The final cherry on top of this industry-wide damning sundae is that Magic didn't even bother finishing its design until years after its release. For 6 whole years, well into the introduction of the DCI and the Pro Tour, Magic the Gathering secretly masqueraded as a tournament-ready, competitive game, when in fact, it wasn't even technically playable because it was not yet formally defined. What am I referring to, you may ask? Priority and the stack. Until the release of 6th edition, which was in 1999, the concept of priority and the stack had not been formally defined. For some reason, the implications of this go over a lot of people's heads, but what this means is that between the release of Alpha and the release of 6th edition, the rules of Magic were only ever subjectively defined, either based on the whims of players or by forcing judges to guess at rulings. I suppose they figured everyone would be too caught up in playing to notice, or that if they did, no one would speak up because the notion that Magic's rules weren't complete would sound crazy. I suppose, though, that if a judge never got called during any of a player's matches, that those matches would have been solely determined by the momentary whims and lapses in calling perceived misplays of that player and their opponents. They just guessed whenever they weren't sure, and nobody spoke up for the whole tournament. Statistically speaking, that had to have happened. Now, I think a lot of you out there are thinking that WotC has proven me wrong because they've scammed you for so long, we have to consider them a success. The amount of money they've pumped out of everyone is just so much that even if they collapsed, you'd still have to recognize them. Sure, that's true, but here's the rub. The bubble that's about to pop is when everyone collectively realizes that all formats of Magic and every other trading card game, except of course Mage War, are pay to win. They're solvable, broken, simply an activity that you can do when you spend oodles of money and are playing against someone who spent less. It's not a game. These are not collectible game pieces, and they never were. The only thing valuable about a Black Lotus is its historical value. It was the first Magic card to scam you.